Does anybody know, I know that Council Boucher is going to be here, but,
Councilor Rice Hawkins is going to be about 10 minutes late.
okay, okay, thank you.
Yep.
I don't know whether there's anybody else.
That's Fred.
There's two, okay, good.
There you go.
Okay, welcome everyone. Mr. Manager, do you want to kick this off?
Certainly. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, so we have our racial equity training from the National League of Cities. And the program will start at 5 o'clock right now and go until 8 o'clock. We have the folks online from DC, from National League of Cities are online. They get ready to start the program. And,
You want to do a roll call?
we could, yep. I have the
Yeah, you should.
city roll call. Councilor Bouchard,
Here.
Mayor Boulay,
Presence.
Councilor Champlin,
Here.
Councilor Fennessy, Councilor Grady Sexton.
Here.
Councilor Keach,
Here.
Councilor Kennison,
Here.
Councilor Kretovic is excused. Did I understand it? Excused. Councilor Mattson,
Here.
Councilor McNamara,
Here.
Councilor Nyan, excused. Councilor Pierce,
Here.
Councilor Rice Hawkins, I'll leave that open. Councilor Todd, Councilor Werner. And I'll just make a note to Councilor Alexa here also. Ready to go? Thank you.
So yeah, I think we'll just start now with the introduction from National League of Cities to the City Council.
Good afternoon, Council. We are really grateful to be here with you all this evening. And welcome to our Normalizing Racial Equity in Local Government workshop. And we can go on to the next slide, Melissa. I want to start off by introducing myself. My name is Daryl Edwards. I am the Senior Program Specialist for Race, Equity, and Leadership, focused on city engagement. And I come to this work most recently from working with the County of Arlington in Virginia, where I started with their Chief Race and Equity Officer to begin doing racial equity work with Arlington County. Prior to that, I did a lot of research in graduate school, and I've worked on multiple positions where I've talked about racial equity in urban atmospheres. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Jared Bean.
Thank you, Daryl, and hello, everybody. My name is Jared Bean, and I am essentially Daryl's counterpart for the state leagues, but we frequently work together in both sides. And before coming here, I worked in immigration advocacy and also within the DOE of New York City, where I was working to create more equitable solutions for school zones and schools in general. And I'm going to pass it over to Melissa.
Hello, welcome all. My name is Melissa Jones, and I am Royal's Contracts Manager. I have the pleasure of working with both Daryl and Jared, along with Shauna, who will introduce herself in just a moment, on both our city engagements and our state league contracts. So everything from start to finish and in between. So excited to be here with you all virtually, but also we're still present. And so again, just happy to be here. And I've been with National League of Cities for 2 years, actually. December 2nd marked 2 years for me. I actually started in business events. I have an entrepreneurial background, was in events for a while, very long time, ran my own events business. And then I came to NLC. They stole me, if you will. And it's been a pleasure to work in this department. So again, we're just so happy to deliver this workshop to the City of Concord. So, and I'm going to pass it on over to our leader, Shauna Davey.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And I want to say a tremendous thank you to the council, to the mayor, and in particular to Tom and Jim for the opportunity to connect with you all this evening. We know that you had a very late night yesterday, and so we appreciate your time and your attention and the opportunity to support you in all of the great work that you continue to do for all of your residents in Concord. My name is Shauna Davey. I serve as the new director of the Race, Equity, and Leadership Department at National League of Cities, and we're so pleased to be with you all this evening. I will be more so in the background with Melissa, providing support to the team. You are in fantastic hands, and I'll also be coming on to support the remarks, reactions, reflections, and questions section. So you'll see me at that point, but we're very delighted to be with you, and thank you again. And I'll turn it back over to Daryl to take us into the next section.
Thank you, Shauna. And so we normally like to start off with virtual housekeeping, where we ask that you all as participants stay actively engaged and willing to learn. We can skip over the next one because you won't really be logging out. But you know, if you all have, and when you do have questions and concerns, if we can just hold them, maybe write them down and leave them for the remarks, reactions, reflections, and questions section. When Shauna takes over, we can answer those and respond to those during those sections. Next slide, Melissa. And so these are the three objectives that we have for our time together today, and we hope that by the end of our session, we can achieve these three things. And so the first one is understand how government laws and policies help to create and maintain racial inequities. Number two, gain insight into the context of historical events and current implications as they relate to institutional and systemic racism in the United States. And lastly, but certainly not least, develop a shared understanding of racial equity terminology and concepts. And so those are the three objectives we hope to get through by the end of our time together today. Next slide, Melissa. And so wanted to just run through really quickly on the next two slides our agenda for the day. I'm not sure if you all have the paper agenda, but these are the main topics that we'll be getting through today. And so as we already finished with you all's welcome and introduction, we're going through our welcome and introduction. The next section we go over is why we lead with race, then national practices, history of government and race, a section we call sticky history. We'll then move over to terms and concepts. Next slide, Melissa. After our terms and concepts, we will move into that first remarks, reactions, reflections, and questions section. We'll take I believe it's a 10-minute break. After the 10-minute break, we will go into a section we call understanding racism and racial disparities. We'll go over what a solidarity dividend is, as well as some examples. Next steps for local leaders. And we'll have our second session section for remarks, reactions, reflections, and questions. And then we'll have a wrap up. And so that'll be our agenda for the day. But wanted to just run through that with you all really quickly so you know what to expect. Next slide, Melissa. And so this right here is just our mission and vision for the work that we do. And so our mission is to build local leaders' knowledge and capacity to eliminate racial disparities, heal racial divisions, and build more equitable communities. And our vision for how we get that work done is, we envision a nation in which every local official is equipped to effectively lead and serve an inclusive, thriving, and healthy community. We do these by focusing on three main strategies, which include training and technical assistance, compiling and producing resources and building networks of city leaders engaged in racial equity, as well as supporting city and staff as they integrate racial equity into their work. And so those are the three things that we focus on in order to achieve our mission and vision. Next slide, Melissa. We always like to give acknowledgement and look toward our partners at Race Forward, as well as the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which you all may know as GARE. And these right here are just their missions and why they do the work that they do. But we always like to acknowledge that this is not while it is small, those who are focused on training others, we don't do it by ourselves, and these are our partners. Next slide, Melissa. And so we'd like to just go over our learning environment as we begin to think about this work, and as we start our journey and thinking about how do we create racially equitable communities. And so the first thing we have here is what is learned here leaves here. Our hope is that you as council, any tools, terminologies, concepts that you pick up today, you can have those conversations with community members as well as your peers. Our hope is that you'll be open-minded. You'll hear some things that you've never heard before. You may hear some things you have heard before, but our goal is for you to be open-minded so that we can continue to have open discussion around some of the terms and concepts that we go over today. The next one is start where you are. We have no expectation that you have a level of understanding or knowledge when you come into this work, but our hope is that wherever you begin this work is where you'll move on. And then lastly, expect and accept a lack of closure. We fully are aware that racial inequities have existed in our country for more than 400 years, and we cannot expect to get through this tough topic in 3 hours, or the 3 hours that we have together. So our hope is that by the end of our time, even if you feel like there are some things that you want to learn more about, we will try to provide those resources, but knowing that we will not finish nor finish having these discussions at the end of our time together, but it's okay to have a lack of closure as we begin to build on the terms and concepts that we go over today. Next slide, Melissa. And so this slide also just talks about our assumptions, what we bring to this work. First and foremost, race matters. We fully are aware that race is a topic that is very difficult to talk about in our country. It has always been difficult. It's something that we're not able to acknowledge. But in order for us to begin to have real conversations about race, we have to make sure that we put that forward. None of us created the inequities we see today, but we all have a responsibility to solve them. It is clear that none of us had a hand in creating these inequities, as the slide mentions, but we all have a responsibility in making sure that they don't persist to our current environments. And so as we begin to think about this, we have to understand that we all have a part to play, as well as we all benefit from the work that we do on racial equity, regardless of where we come from, regardless of our background. And so just thinking about that, it is clear, or what we want to be clear about, is that our assumption is that while there are inequities that exist, we all have a responsibility to solve them, and we all benefit from solving those inequities. And then we can't solve something we can't talk about. This is what I said just now early on about race matters. We can't have a conversation about race. We can't begin to put the pieces together to help us, move forward when it comes to creating that racially equitable community if we don't talk about these things that exist. And so understanding that race matters, we need to, we're all responsible for solving these inequities. We all benefit from solving these inequities, and we can't solve something that we can't talk about. Next slide, Melissa. And this slide talks about our national practice on how we achieve racial equity. And we start off, which is what we're doing today with you all, is having a conversation about normalizing racial equity. And during our normalizing workshop, which you'll see today, we try to create a shared analysis and definitions around what it means to have conversations around racial equity. Understanding that in order for us to begin to have real discussions about it, we have to use the same terminology. We have to have the same understanding about where we started so we can have a better understanding about where we need to go. After we move from that normalizing section, we move over to our organizing section where it says internal infrastructure and building partnerships. And internal infrastructure really means, do you all, as the city of Concord, have the internal infrastructure to make sure that racial equity is not something you're just doing, but it's embedded into the work that you do every day? What that means is, do you have a core team that is focused or paying attention to racial equity? Do you have department heads that are focused on racial equity? Do you have a team that is made up of the breadth and depth of your organization that allows you to really take a look into what the city is doing to make sure that you're making you have the most equitable outcomes? And so that's what we mean when we say internal infrastructure. And partnerships really mean, as we take a look at communities, the larger community, do you have partnerships with community organizations? What do your partners look like? What do they do? How do you take their feedback into consideration as you make policies and procedures? And so that's what we mean when we talk about organizing. We then move on to operationalizing. And operationalizing is really where we get into the nitty-gritty parts of this work, where we start to talk about the racial equity tools and using data to develop these strategies that drive results. What that really means is, are we looking at all of the policies that we create, all of the policies that we're using, and saying, are we using a racial equity lens? Are we making sure that everyone is included in the work that we're doing. And if we're not doing that, we may need to change some of the ways that we think about things, as well as some of the processes that we're using. Most of all, as you can see in the center here on this slide, we talk about visualizing. Visualizing is the core principle for understanding how we normalize, organize, and operationalize. Visualizing a racially equitable community is where you get to say, what do we want Concord to look like? How can we create a space that everyone feels welcome? And so we start off with visualizing as we begin to normalize conversations, normalize for racial equity, organize for racial equity, and then eventually operationalize racial equity for the city of Concord. As we move on to the next slide, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Jared to talk to us about why we lead with race.
Thank you, Daryl. And before we go any further in this workshop, or in this presentation rather, we wanted to touch briefly on why it is we lead with race. Occasionally, organizations, institutions will want to engage in equity training, but they'll want to do so in a way that doesn't fully engage with or lead with talking about race. And instead, they're hoping that they'll be able to focus on other areas where inequity is present, such as socioeconomic status. Doing this, however, would neglect to address the full scope of the inequities that we see. To reiterate what Daryl said, the most direct reason why we lead with race is also the most obvious. Race matters. It mattered during the formation of our country and the evolution of our laws, our practices, and our structures. While the strategies outlined in our trainings aren't a one-to-one for tackling other issues, solutions that center race can help inform the frameworks for other inequities, such as ableism, ageism, xenophobia, classism, sexism, and heterosexism. However, solutions that do not consider race will perpetuate inequity. This is because of how intentionally discrimination based on race has been baked in throughout all of our governance. Let me go to the next slide, Melissa. And while we lead with race, we do want to consider how systems of oppression overlap if we are to truly implement equitable policies and create equitable solutions. This brings us to the concept of intersectionality, which was first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. This discusses the impacts of these overlaps. People and communities exist across an array of demographic lines, including race, religion, gender, sexuality, immigration, ability status, and socioeconomic status. The more barriers and systemic marginalization a person or a community experiences is in direct relation to the number of marginalized groups they fall within. This produces what we call compound inequities. We must continually evaluate how each of these markers as public leaders and as staff if we're to ensure that the policies and solutions we create are as equitable as possible. Doing so helps foster the kind of solidarity that we want to generate. And while doing this, we still need to keep in mind that race remains the biggest predictor of success and marginalization in our country. Okay. We're now going to transition to our history of government and race section. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. And the first part of the section is a section that we call American Values versus Realities. This section touches on just a few of the values that our country has as a society, as a nation. And these are values that are very fundamental to how we see ourselves. But they're also values that haven't always been rooted in the full reality of the situation on the ground. So I'm going to read out a value statement that has been written at some point in our history. And as I'm reading it, because this isn't something that we can have call outs or sharing in the chat, we just want you to write down your response on a piece of paper. That way you can kind of keep a tally of the guesses that you're making along the way, to just see how many of these you already knew, what is maybe a bit newer to you or a bit rusty from history class. And keep in mind that this is meant to be, a little bit fun as we're moving forward. And it's okay that if you don't have all of the right answers right away. This is more to get us into the space. Go to the next slide. Okay, so this first one is all men are created equal. I'm going to give you just a few seconds to think of your response, write it down. Where did this come from? Why was it written? And also, when was it written? So we can go ahead and put the answer on the screen. The Declaration of Independence. And one more moment. And let's bring up that. All right. Okay, so this was the Declaration of Independence. It was written in 1776. And it starts out as follows. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this is also the point where we would ask you who this applied to initially. And even though we can't get the call outs that we would want to have, also write down who you think this applied to at the time. And when we think about who this value in 1776 was written for, it was written for rich white landowners, rich white male landowners. And this, though it was a lofty ideal and something that we want to continually try to live up to, it was authored by Thomas Jefferson, who was our founding father, our third president. And he was also someone who owned enslaved Africans and was the father of 6 children with Sally Hemings, who was an enslaved African-American woman. This document also asserted that indigenous people were an existential threat. And the targeting of indigenous people was baked into the project of our founding. We mentioned that this applied to male landowners at the time. And in our history, suffrage is a bit convoluted, but for a significant period of time, most states only allowed free property owning men to vote. So again, this was and remains a very important fundamental value for our country, but it is one that took quite a long time to begin living up to. Next slide. Okay, so the next one is with liberty and justice for all. I'm going to give you a quick couple of beats to write down your response. Okay, we can pull it up now. It came from the Pledge of Allegiance, and it was written in 1942. Okay, so the Pledge of Allegiance, again, it was a very, and remains a very important, very foundational value. We are a democracy. We're founded with the idea of providing liberty and justice for all. But at that time, it didn't apply to everybody. Brown v. Board didn't end school segregation until 1954. The Civil Rights Act didn't end legal segregation until 1964. And only then did that pave the way for the Immigration and Nationality Act of '65, which abolished the national origins quota that fostered blatant discrimination in our immigration system. And that same year, 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. And even with these positive changes, longstanding issues within our systems, particularly criminal justice, remain at odds with values behind this, or the reality behind these values. The next slide. Okay. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. I'll give you a few quick seconds to write down where you think it was written and when you think it was written. Okay. I'm bringing it up now. It was from the Gettysburg Address and was delivered in 1863. Now, at this time, this was coming at a very tumultuous time for our country, and we were on the trajectory for the abolition of slavery that hadn't come yet. But when it was written, Black people were not fully considered people. They were considered three-fifths. And at this time, during and beyond this, the delivery of this particular speech, Indigenous people were and remained excluded from the narrative. They would continue to be targeted by our federal government long after this period. And at this time, women were still considered property. They did not have the suffrage rights. They did not have the kinds of rights and freedoms afforded to men. So again, these values are very, very foundational. They are very lofty goals that are things that we rightfully uphold as things that we want to strive for. The important thing to realize is that government hasn't always served people to their full benefit, that slavery, indigenous genocide were baked into the founding, baked into the process, and that even today, things like Citizens United remain at odds with some of the loftier, more poignant parts of these goals. But these are things that we can still and do still strive to attain. Next slide. We're now going to transition into a section we call Sticky History. Go to the next slide. And for this section, we're going to do it in much the same way that we just did the previous one. I'm going to bring up a particular historical point that has occurred along our history. And I want you to guess the decade that it occurred in. So just make sure that you're writing it down, keeping your own tally if you're able to, and seeing how many of these you already knew about. If you didn't know about it, if you were able to kind of somewhat pinpoint where you think it actually occurred. And keep in mind that these are things that we're seldom taught in history class. We don't really discuss them, generally speaking, in the national dialogue. And they're things that, we're not expected to know, but they're things that are important to know. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. The first section of this is called Sticky History, and we're covering race and land. Okay, this first one is the Indian Appropriations Act. It created the reservation system in which Indigenous people were not allowed to leave without permission. 20 years later, an act by the same name stripped federal recognition of tribes as independent nations. When do we think this occurred? I'll give you a couple of moments, a couple of beats to think about it and write it down. Okay, and let's go ahead and pull it up. Okay, it occurred in 1851. Let me go to the next slide. Okay, this is the Dawes Act. It allowed the U.S. government to break up tribal lands in an effort to drive assimilation into a federally imposed system of private property. Indigenous people could only qualify for citizenship if they complied with this act, and this resulted in more than 90 million acres of tribal land being sold to non-native U.S. citizens. So I'm going to give you a couple of quick beats to think about and put your response down. What decade do you think it occurred in? Okay, we can pull it up. This is in 1887. Okay, and we go to the next slide. And this is the last one for this section. This is the Homestead Act. It allocated Native American land to, quote, anyone who could pay $1.25 and cultivate it for 5 years. Since the Homestead Act only applied to U.S. citizens, Native Americans, Black people, and non-European immigrants were excluded. So think about what decade it occurred in and write it down. Okay, we can bring it up. Okay, it occurred in 1862. Go to the next. And in this section, we're going to talk about race and housing. Okay, this first one is redlining. This is something that has been coming up more and more in the national discussion. So maybe we're a little bit more familiar with it. So redlining was a policy in which the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, determined areas that were deemed fit for investment by banks and other financial services companies. Areas were physically demarcated with red shading on a map, and this was based primarily on the assigned, quote, risk level associated with the area's racial composition. Let's take a beat to think what decade this occurred in. And we can go ahead and bring it in. It was in 1834. Sorry, wow, 1934. Okay, go to the next slide.
Unfortunately.
And this is Berman v. Parker. This is a ruling by the Supreme Court that allowed local government to take properties by eminent domain to rebuild areas it considered blighted. Take a quick beat to think about when this occurred. And as we're giving some space to put down the decade you think this occurred in, it's important to unpack the work that the word blighted is doing. This was often a smoke screen to target areas that were primarily neighborhoods that housed people of color, particularly Black communities and Latino communities. Okay. Okay, and it occurred in 1954. Go to the next slide. Okay, the Housing Act is part of the Fair Deal. This gave federal, state, and local governments unprecedented power to shape residential life. One of the Housing Act's main initiatives, quote, urban renewal, destroyed about 2,000 communities and forced more than 300,000 families from their homes. Overall, about half of urban renewal's victims were Black. So when do we think that this occurred? Think about the decade it happened in. And we'll go ahead and put it on the screen. Okay, it was in 1949. We're now going to transition to the next section, which focuses on race and immigration. Okay, first up, we have the Emergency Quota Act. It added 2 new features to American immigration law: numerical limits on immigration and the use of a quota system for establishing those limits. This came to be known as the National Origins Formula. This was done to limit the number of Southern and Eastern European immigrants and other, quote, undesirable immigrants from entering the US. 3 years later, a similar law excluded Asian immigrants. So when do we think this happened? What decade? Bring it on the screen. This occurred in 1921.
Red Scare.
Go to the next slide. Okay, now we're at the Page Act. This is a law designed to bar entry into the US for Chinese, Japanese, and other Asian communities based on rhetoric deriding immigrant labor and perpetuating misogynist stereotypes to exclude Asian women from immigration. While anti-labor sentiment helped pass the law, it effectively barred East Asian women from entering the country while allowing East Asian men to come as laborers. This law marked the end of open borders in the US. So when do we think that this happened? Put down the decade you think it occurred, and we'll pull it up. It occurred in 1875. Okay, and the last one for this section is the launch of Operation Gatekeeper. U.S. Border Patrol assigned 200 additional agents to guard the 14 miles of border between the U.S. and Mexico south of San Diego. This strategy of prevention by deterrence led to an intentional outcome derided as deterrence by death and is considered the birth of border militarization. More than 10,000 migrants have died as a result of the strategy. So when do we think this occurred? Okay, and bring it on screen. 1994. It's important to note that the strategies that this strategy under differing names continues to lead to these outcomes. That 10,000 figure is over the last few decades since it started. Okay, and this last section is for race and citizenship. Okay, this one is the U.S. versus Begotten. And this was a Supreme Court ruling that recognized that Indians are, quote, scientifically classified as Caucasians, but concluded that they are not white in the, quote, popular understanding, and thus cannot become citizens. When do we think this occurred? Give you a couple more seconds to think and put down your response. And let's bring it up. 1923. Next slide. Okay, the Civil Rights Act of blank. This granted citizenship to all persons born in the U.S., but did not extend to Native Americans. Previously, naturalization only extended to, quote, free white persons per the U.S. Naturalization Act of 1790. When do we think this happened? Give me another second to write it down. And let's bring it on screen. This is in 1866. Now, it's important to note that granting citizenship did not confer guaranteed rights of citizenship. This allowed for the regressive laws like those seen during the Jim Crow era. And last in this section is the Burke Act. This amended the Dawes Act that we talked about earlier by establishing that Indigenous people could only become citizens at the end of a 25-year probationary land ownership period known as trust patents. When do we think this occurred? Okay, we can bring it on screen. Okay, it was in 1906. So this section, this is the last part of Sticky History, and this section touched on how our history with race has impacted a wide range of issues, from housing and land to immigration and citizenship. There are plenty of other areas. In fact, any other area you can think of has also been impacted by race, but these are a few key ones that we want to touch on during our time today. This serves as a reminder that the impacts of racism in government have profound and wide-ranging implications. Okay, and as we come out of this section, I'm going to turn it back over to Daryl.
Thank you, Jared. I hope that section was not only enlightening, but fruitful, just in understanding some parts of our history that we either know something about but don't talk often about, or those that we may not know about at all. And we hope that this can increase our conversation around the historical importance of some of these facts. We're going to now move over into our terms and concepts that we use to begin to normalize these conversations around racial equity. And we can go to the next slide. And so the first slide here that we have is, what does racial equity mean? And so we start off here with racial inequity. And so racial inequity, as the slide states, is outcome gaps between people of different races based on historical or current factors or structures. We're trying to move from racial inequities to creating and focusing on racial equity. And so racial equity centers those who are worse off, who were worse off, and moving from a service-based approach toward focusing on policies and institutions and structures that focus on making sure that there's equitable outcomes for all. Racial equity is a condition that in which, if it's achieved, one's racial identity is no longer a predictor of how one fares. When we use this term, we're trying to make sure that we understand that racial equity is part of racial justice, and thus we also include the work to address root causes of the inequities, not just the manifestation or the things that we see that show up on the surface. And so it is important for us to understand that racial equity is focused on improving outcomes. The focus is making sure that there are equitable outcomes for all. Next slide, Melissa. And so we use this picture to illustrate what we mean when we talk about the difference between equality and equity. Oftentimes, these two terms are used synonymously, but they are different. And as we see, equality is focused on sameness. And so the top portion of this picture, we see that everyone is trying to get to their destination and everyone is given the same type of bike. But understanding that we all start from different places, we want to move from this idea or thought process around equality and move toward that thought process and thinking around equity. And equity, as mentioned in the last slide, should be focused on outcomes, and it means justice. And so equity is about the fairness that everyone receives, making sure that they have the opportunities and the resources based on their need, based on their given circumstances. And this slide is important because we want to illustrate the difference between giving everyone the same thing when we all may not need the same thing because we're all not starting from the same place. And so making that distinction is very important when we think about how do we create an equitable community for everyone. Next slide, Melissa. Next, we want to break down the definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. While we've talked about equity just a little bit, oftentimes when people use diversity, equity, and inclusion, or what's termed now as DEI, oftentimes it is just one lump sum, but we don't really understand the distinction between the three. And so diversity really focuses on, the presence of different people, the presence of different demographics. We oftentimes hear people say, well, a person is diverse. A person cannot be diverse. A group can be diverse, meaning that group is made up of different persons, but a person in and of themselves cannot be diverse. We want to make sure that when we say diversity, what we mean is, it includes all the characteristics that make up an individual group. And so we want to make sure that when we say diversity, we're saying that, as I mentioned before, the presence of different people and different demographics. When we talk about equity, we're talking about the process of ensuring that processes/programs are fair, impartial, and responsive to eliminating gaps and disparities in outcomes. Again, when we hear equity, we have to think about outcomes, making sure that these outcomes are fair. And then when we think about inclusion, what inclusion means is while we have all of these different persons, while we have all of these different demographics in a space, we want to make sure that they coexist well. We want to make sure that there's a sharing of power as we begin to include everyone in the space. We want to make sure that no one is excluded, and we want to make sure that the people who are included, all parts of them are included in the process, the activity, as well as the decision-making process. And so as we think about that, we want to make sure that we understand the difference between diversity and inclusion, understanding that diversity is the presence of different people, and inclusion talks about how do we make those different people work in the same space together so that it's working efficiently and equitably. And we'll move on to the next slide that just shows a brief picture of what we mean when we say diversity and inclusion. And so diversity is the mix, inclusion is making the mix work. As we see on the left-hand side, we have lots of different vegetables, fruits, a makeup of lots of different things, and it looks good, but we don't know if it's going to taste good. We don't know how people are going to interact with it. But when we think about inclusion, what we want to think about is that salad. Oftentimes when we have a salad, I don't know how you all feel about salad, but I like my salad to be mixed up. I like it to work together. I want to add the dressing. And when I add the dressing, it's all supposed to come together. But if you just have a salad where the lettuce is on the side, the peppers are on the side, then it's not working well together. And the idea is that inclusion means we want to make sure that the salad tastes good because it works together. We want to make sure as a department, as an organization, as a city, all of the different people that make the city of Concord great all feel like it's great because they are part of the decision-making process. They're included in all the steps to help the city be great. And so those are just the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as how we understand the difference between diversity and inclusion. Next slide, Melissa. And so in this section, we want to talk about bias and understanding that bias is both explicit and implicit. Explicit just meaning that it is expressed directly. It is things that we actively engage with, whereas implicit are things that are going on in the background that is going on in the subconscious that we may not be aware of. The slide says here that the brain processes 11 million bits per second. What that means is that the brain is processing multiple things at one time. It is very difficult for the brain to parse out what's happening, how to react to certain things. And what this says for us is that we all exhibit or show bias in one way or the other. We are not, one person can't say, well, I don't have any biases. We all have biases. But what do we do when we're aware of those biases? And how do we react to someone when we see something based on a story that we've been told? We'll talk more about this as we get through the implicit and explicit biases. Next slide, Melissa. And so this slide talks about the schemas, the frames through which our brains help us understand and navigate the world. So oftentimes bias, immediately, it's sort of a space for us to create safety nets for ourselves. We begin, when we see something, our biases sort things into categories. We create associations and we fill in the gaps. Sometimes when we fill in those gaps, we filled in those gaps with wrong information or information based on something we may have seen or heard, something that we were exposed to, but not fully exposed to. So we just received something, we saw something, we began to fill in the gaps. This is not what we're supposed to do. While bias in a way helps us to organize information, oftentimes that is going on in the subconscious, and it's important for us to be clear that we cannot act on those biases. Well, as I mentioned before, while those biases exist, we cannot act on those biases. Next slide, Melissa. And so we're going to play this video for you. We're going to play it through, and then I'll have a brief comment right after we finish watching.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Okay, think about it for a moment. We're going to come back. We'll see if you got the right answer. Go ahead, Moses.
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Thank you, Melissa. And so, firstly, let's pause and say, did we all see that? If you saw the video before, you probably saw the moonwalking bear. If you did not, if you have not seen this video before, it's not likely that you saw the moonwalking bear. One is because we asked you to count how many passes the team in white makes. And so if you're focused on the team in white making passes, you may have gotten that 13. You may have said 12, you may have said 14, you may have said 11. But the idea is that what we asked you to focus on is what you were focused on. And so the idea is that after we begin to just focus on the things that we would like to see, that means that we're not seeing the other things that are existing in that space. What is important to know here is that our brain focuses on what we're accustomed to and what we've been conditioned to pay attention to. Regardless of who we are, where we've been, where we lived, bias exists in all institutions of our lives and really defines our experiences. It is important for us to be aware of how our biases show up every day so that we can not just immediately react when we see something or hear something that is different than what we're accustomed to. Next slide, Melissa. And so, as this slide says, implicit biases do not reflect reality. Oftentimes, our implicit biases, as I mentioned before, are telling us things. This slide says that, when we are exposed or socialized to certain identity groups, groups being paired with certain characteristics, we automatically make those, as the previous slide said, we fill in those gaps. And so we then begin to create attitudes, believe in stereotypes, create beliefs about different people. And that can affect the decisions we make. And even though this slide focuses on how we treat others, we want to think about it from a 30-foot level. The systems, the policies we put in place, we begin to think about certain people in a certain way. And thus we begin to embed the policies, practices, and procedures that we create with those biases there. It is important that we do not let our biases become our realities and thus the realities of the communities that we support. And so we have to be mindful of this, that, as I mentioned before, these biases exist, but we cannot allow them to shape our reality. Next slide, Melissa. And so this slide says, if you have a brain, you have a bias. I always like this slide because the idea is that a lot of people will try to tell you, oh, well, I try to be as impartial as we intentionally try to be. There's certain things we just can't do. We are going to have those biases are going to show up. And trying to actively suppress those things will not work. Knowing that bias is a part of our humanity, we have to begin to examine our own biases. This requires some external perspectives because many of our biases, as mentioned before, are unconscious. What should we do? Be accountable. Take time to examine those beliefs. Take time to ask ourselves, where did that come from? Where did that first show up? Why do I believe this thing? Beyond that, in order to begin to turn some of those things on their head, we have to take action. What does that mean? We need to expose ourselves and increase our awareness of who other people are and some of those other thoughts outside of the ones we subscribe to, be able to understand other people's experiences and thought process. Only by doing those things, and the ones I listed, those are not the only things you can do. Those are just a few examples of things you can do. But those ones that I've listed, once we begin to take those into consideration, what we then do is we're challenging the things that we see every day. When we have an immediate thought, it is good for us to pause and say, was that the right thought? How did I come to that thought? Was that because I did research and I had conversations and I made sure that I was aware of what was going on? Or was that a quick reaction just based on something I heard or read or saw? And so as we begin to think about the fact that bias exists, the next step is, what are we going to do to take action to what is the word I'm looking for? To push back, fight back against those biases. And so as we think about those things, it's important to make sure that we are aware, acknowledge that the bias occurs, acknowledge that we are all biased, and acknowledge that the bias is there, and then actively make decisions to increase your awareness so that that bias isn't maintained. Next slide, Melissa. And in this slide, what we'd like to do is just show you where bias exists on both the individual and institutional level. And so we start on the left-hand side where we talk about the institutional and explicit. Policies where it explicitly discriminates against a group. An example with which we talked about earlier was redlining. Redlining was the FHA, as we learned, actively, intentionally making decisions that discriminated against Black people and people of color. Making policies that said, we will not provide loans to people who live in this area because it was risky. That was an institutional, explicit bias. And as I said, when we think about biases, if we're not challenging our biases, we then begin to embed those biases in those policies. That is what we consider to be institutional and explicit. When we think about institutional and implicit, those are policies that negatively impact one group unintentionally. An example we have here is the GI Bill. After World War II, when veterans were coming back, while unintentionally, we weren't providing the GI Bill to all citizens. Namely, those who were receiving it were white citizens, and those who were not receiving it, Black citizens. And so while the policy in of itself didn't say that it was supposed to go to one or the other, in practice, due to those biases, that's how it was showing up. And so we have to be mindful not only about those explicit ones, but also those implicit ones. We then move to individual explicit. Prejudice in action or discrimination. An example of that is a realtor refusing to provide service to people of color. Explicitly, the realtor is saying, because you look a certain way and I believe this truth or this stereotype, I'm not going to provide you with a service. Explicit on the individual level. We then move over to the individual implicit, and we talk about unconscious beliefs and attitudes. An example of that is a realtor giving a low home appraisal subconsciously to people of color. Oftentimes, when we think about the explicit helps us to think about what we do on an implicit level. And so when the realtor shows up at the house, they see a person of color, and immediately they're like, well, this isn't valued the way it should be. Or they say, it doesn't deserve this level of value, this much. And so we have to be mindful that, as I said before, these biases exist everywhere. We just have to be mindful about how we interact with them so that they don't show up in either an institutional or on an individual basis. We can now move on to the next slide. Thank you, Melissa. And so these are the three different levels of racism. And so when we think about racism, we of course think about it on the individual level, which talks about prejudgment, bias, or discrimination by an individual based on race. While it is important to understand the definition behind the individual level of racism, the ones we really want to focus on for our time together is the institutional and structural. And so institutional racism are policies, practices, and procedures that either intentionally or unintentionally advantage white people and disadvantage people of color. It's important that we understand that on an institutional level, this is the way that racism shows up. Structural racism is where history and current reality of institutional racism across all institutions combines to create a system that negatively impacts people of color. And so structural racism is when you put all of these different pieces together and we create a system that disadvantages and negatively impacts people of color. Next slide. This leads us to what we call systemic racism, which is a system of oppression based on race that is used to the advantage of white people and to the disadvantage of people of color. This requires institutional power and authority to perpetuate inequity. The main takeaway here is that individuals can perpetuate systemic racism through their implicit or explicit biases, and institutional biases perpetuate systemic racism regardless of the actions of the individual, unless we as individuals actively work to negate these systems. I want to say that last part one more time. Even though we think about it at the institutional, structural, and systemic level, it is important that we understand that we as individuals have a role to play to actively negate these systems. I will now pass it on to my director, Shauna, to lead us for our reactions, remarks, reactions, reflections, and questions.
Thank you, Daryl. And we have about 25 minutes until about 6:30. to give an opportunity to the council to share any remarks, reactions, reflections, or questions that you all have with each other. We wanted to create an opportunity for you all to have a conversation with each other about the information that was just shared, and wanted to frame that through the lens of remarks, reactions, reflections, and questions. And so we want to invite you all to share. We'd love for each person to have an opportunity to share. So if you could keep your remarks, reactions, reflections, and questions to 1 to 2 minutes or so, so that your colleagues and counterparts have an opportunity to share as well, that'd be great. And we'll come back on and wrap up right at 30 after the hour to make sure that you all have a break before we move into the final section of our workshop this evening.
So I think at this point we can just open it up to the group. Does anybody like to start and ask questions or make reflections or remarks?
Before we do that, can you just explain to me the dynamics of this? So the folks at National League of Cities, can they hear us, or they?
Yes. So when the screen is on, when the screen is on us, when you can see us on TV, they can hear us, but what they're seeing is us, and when they're talking, what they see is them themselves. So that's just all the way we had to structure it.
Okay, no problem. Just want to understand that. I'll do this. Other Pierce?
This was interesting. I would ask for those that have been on the council for a while, as we went through this and talked about the implicit, explicit biases and all those things that have happened, has this chamber been, I don't want to say guilty, but have we bumped up against that in anyone's recent memory or memory for as long as you've been here?
Yes. Is the short answer.
Well, you and I have been here the same length of time, pretty much, so
Well,
would you explain?
Sure. And I would just say, I thought this presentation was great, you know, going through the history of how racism has been embedded in our institutions for so long. And I was particularly struck by the conversation that these are things we're not taught in school or explicitly taught in school, which is so true and is only going to get worse with the state law that was passed. And I think when we get to the action step, one thing for us to think about is if we truly believe and honor that we need to have this education to be a healthy, equitable, inclusive society, what can we use our power structure as the city of Concord to do to ensure that that happens. But to your question, Counselor, around recent examples, one note I'd made about, the first step on this course is acknowledging bias. And I think that we've had some examples recently where we've struggled to do that as a council. The racial justice letter, after the murder of George Floyd, that conversation was really tough. There's a lot of defensive language that was added, some things that were removed about the historic and current lived experiences of people of color in our community. So for me, those are things, or the decision not to move forward with doing the full review of the police accountability standards. It was hard for me to hear fellow counselors not want to spend the time to go through the best practices, because the time we did spend, we actually improved some of our systems for things we did. We're collecting more demographic data now. We made other changes that I think are going to be important going forward. So I think that sometimes we have a hard time because we heard in both of those types of conversations, we don't have those problems in Concord. And I don't think that's true, and I don't think that's the experience of everybody who lives here either.
Just a quick follow-up. What I hear you saying is, with those conversations, and we sit together on the Public Safety Advisory Board, I hear you saying that because we didn't agree with you, that therefore we have a bias. Is that a wrong assumption?
I really appreciate this question. I think going back to that quote from Dolores is, you got to do the work if you're going to be a leader, right? If you're going to address these issues. And if we decided not to do the work, I think by default we're saying we're not ready to step in and acknowledge this work. So I don't think it's a disagreement. Like, we could do the work and have potentially different outcomes or different thoughts around it. We didn't do the work. That's clear. But I do think we've done the work in other areas. Like, I know we'd asked the city manager at one point about different things the city's done for diversity, equity, inclusion. I was really pleased around some of the stuff, particularly LGBT rights. I think, you know, the city's doing really good there, trying to attract and retain staff members from diverse backgrounds. I think is, sorry, I should say from, you know, underrepresented populations in government. I think that's really, really important, and I think the city is doing a great job there. I just think we have other things we need to do as well.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. I think the first work that we have to do is examine ourselves and our implicit bias. We all have it. I have it. You will hear people say, I'm not racist, some of my best friends are black. You know, things like that, that's implicit bias.
Yeah.
Or there's no such thing as race, that's implicit bias. Holding your pocketbook closer to your body when you see a black person on the street or in the store, that's implicit bias. It's almost an automatic thing that some people would do. And it's a lot of work, and it's very uncomfortable to look at our own biases, because they are there, and it's a lifelong work. I don't think I'll ever overcome all my bias that I'm not aware of. But to do that, we need to do that in order to act on a policy level. We need to understand the institutional and our individual bias. And I can't stress that enough.
Well, you know, it's interesting they were talking about real estate, housing assessments. We know that just in the last number of months, we have heard stories where a person of color had a particular assessment on their house. Okay? You can have a white person do this. Different result. More value. So to what extent is, you know, it is implicit at one level, but it's explicit at another, because that's a decision that somebody made to do that, to make that calculation based on information or their own view of the way things ought to be. So, you know, we've got all this history that none of us are taught. I mean, who's taught in school, for example, that when Levittown was built in the late 40s, that black persons were not allowed in it by government FHA policy? Is that taught in school? No, not really. So it's just things that we live with now. It's not history, it's actually now. So.
I was saying I was taught that in school. Oh, sorry.
That's nice.
Good. Who else would like to? Chair. Go ahead.
I would just like to thank the city manager and those folks that brought this to us, because it is painful, it's uncomfortable, but I think it's very necessary and important. And the more that we're exposed to it and we hear it, the more aware we'll be and the more sensitive we will be to those around us for a more inclusive community. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. It's interesting and historically true that any time we make progress in trying to eliminate bias or institutional or whatever, that there's a pushback. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing a pushback because we're more open and we're talking about race more. And I believe that that the thing behind it is the fear that minority groups, blacks and Latinos, are going to be more than the white population. And I think that's an underlying fear.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a demographic fact.
Mm-hmm. It's a demographic fact.
It's going to happen. And some people don't like it. So.
You are welcome to attend, but this is designed tonight. Is this designed for the council's kind of interaction?
I just wanted her, if
So,
she could give an example of the pushback locally. If she could give an example. Yeah, I think in our legislature, the voting restrictions are one thing. I think the pushback against teaching in schools about our real history, racism, I think those are local things that are happening. That's the pushback. We don't want to hear this. We don't want to hear about our nation's history. I know in school, I was taught very differently than what I know was the history. So I think those are the local things.
You're hearing from parents saying they don't want
so
the good, the bad, and the ugly history taught? Is that what you mean?
So I appreciate your interest, and I'm
Understand her.
I get that, and this is designed for us to kind of talk amongst ourselves.
Okay.
So at some point, there'll be opportunities for the public to participate and such like that. No, but I appreciate you coming out tonight and you're interested in it, so. Who else want to?
What's going through my mind is how are we learning about the different our societal rules? Every year I revisit Ruby Payne. She writes about the rules of our society. And one thing that sticks in my head is people of lower socioeconomic status, usually when you think about food, it's quantity. Our middle class usually is quality, and then the upper class is about presentation. I only share that because I have to stop, and I've learned a lot about my students because I have many different levels of economics. And I'm just curious how we as a group learn and teach and learn from our community about the rules that different social economic levels live by, because they are very different. And if your rules are different than mine, I have bias against you. But once we understand why this level acts or reacts in a certain way, because there's reason behind it, whoa, we see them very differently in a better light, and our biases start to melt away. So my question is, how will we, how can we educate ourselves about those different rules? That's what's going through my mind.
That's very interesting. You know, and I asked my first question on what this council has done. And now I'm sort of I want to fix it. So in your case, how would you fix something like that? Based on the I worked at food pantries, and it was give the folks that come in as much food and how to make this spaghetti sauce, stretch it, and so on and so forth, and the like. So how do you tackle something like that?
I don't think you can tackle it all at once.
Right.
Like I said, every year I have to revisit reading, and every year it reminds me of, okay, that's why this is happening. I think it's our willingness right here to sit down and to start talking about it is first and foremost. And then looking at, I think, some of the problems that we have, and then think about, okay, what don't we know? What fear do we have that's causing, or that can help us eliminate or make this problem less? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's not a one one-stop answer, but.
Right, there's no silver bullet.
Right.
It's like dealing with the homeless population. You deal with it one case at a time.
And there's so many layers in that homeless population. Boy, that's a lot to understand, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Thanks, Your Honor. I think I've said this before, but, you know, in my faith tradition, there is discussion around acts of mercy and acts of justice. And acts of mercy are things like handing out food at the soup kitchen or providing a shelter for the homeless. Acts of justice are oriented towards changing root causes for those situations that require the acts of mercy. Whether you do an ongoing and continuing, you know, acts of mercy, or whether you try to do targeted acts of justice to rectify the situation and to restore a balance, a just balance to life. I think that our challenge, from my perspective, and my challenge, is identifying what are the acts of justice regarding racial bias and all the issues that we've heard discussed so far in the program, you know, as opposed to acts of mercy. You know, how do we identify what are the discrete actions that can be taken to change things systemically versus just kind of taking short-term action. Not that the short-term action isn't important, just like it's important to make sure people are fed, it's important to make sure people don't freeze to death in the winter rather. But I think my challenge, the challenge that I see is identifying what really constitutes fundamental, lasting change.
I think these are all very good questions, and I think, you know, there are a lot of people who offer these types of trainings right here in New Hampshire. We've contracted with an organization, a company that is able to provide us with, you know, the perspective of a municipal body, so I'm hoping that there are some concrete steps that are offered when we get back to the program that'll answer some of these questions about what we as a body can do.
Sitting here next to Rob, one of the things that stuck out to me was when they were giving the examples of some of the, whether things were explicit versus implicit, and, you know, the GI Bill really stuck out to me because it was identified as a example of implicit, but I actually think it was very explicit. And
yes.
I'm sure many of you have probably read The Color of Law, but if you haven't, I would suggest that you read it, because it gives you, it's a fairly short read, and I won't necessarily say that I agree with everything in it, but it gives you a very good historical perspective on decisions that were made by policymakers during a period of time, and the choices that were made in order to solve problems that had an impact on people. And, you know, you could say it was implicit decisions, but I think those were actually decisions that were made that they decided we're fine with making this bargain with the devil in order to achieve something. And many of those decisions have impacted the ways in which our communities have developed over the past, at this point, 80 years or so. So it certainly has made me think a lot more. I read it probably earlier this year. So I would just...
Color of Law?
The Color of Law, yeah. It's only, I think it's only maybe 230 pages. Pretty short. Happy to share it if anybody wants.
Any votes? I guess, you know, I'm anxious to get to talk more about the next phase, but it is about, you know, the question I think somebody posed earlier is that how do we move forward, and how do we want to, what do we do to do that? And I think as was kind of laid out, you know, and I'll speak purely for myself, I mean, individually, to be reflective, and I think we generally do, and how can we make changes individually in our lives to be more thoughtful and reflective, But I think as leaders around this community, we have a responsibility to make sure that we are not putting those policies and practices to institutionalize racism that was talked about. And that's, I think, you know, your comment about putting the work in is an absolutely appropriate comment, in that, you know, I every day I think I can do a better job, and that's just figuring out how we can do a better job, and so that we don't create structural hurdles and barriers and create situations of racism that become fixed with power and authority and such. So as we move forward, I guess how I'm thinking about it in my head, and I have to organize things, I like the way it was laid out in terms of the individual, the institution, and the structurals.
Thank you. I'm thinking, you know, we're all a product of our environment. And I remember as a kid, when they were desegregating the schools, you know, black kids went to one school and whites went to another, and the black schools were inferior. And my mother said, you know, they're all right in their place. Now, I heard that growing up. And the little rhymes that we used to sing about catch a tiger by the toe, it used to be something else. And we call pig piles now, used to be something else. And those are the things that have lasting impressions on us that we didn't think anything of as kids. It was like, okay, it's okay to say those things. So just, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Darrell, it's about 6:23 on our clock.
Sorry, yes. So it is 6:23. I know that based on the agenda that we had, we would begin a break between 6:25 and 6:35. And so what we can do, Sean, I don't know if you want to offer anything before we go to break really quickly, but wanting to, I appreciate you, Tom, for giving that time check, making sure that we can take a break between 6:25 and 6:35. Shauna?
Absolutely. We just really appreciate the discussion that you all are having, and hope that you will continue to have the conversation as you have been. We will definitely be sharing additional resources. Greatly appreciate the resources that have been shared amongst the group thus far. And we'll say that we will discuss a little bit about some of the ways to get started in the second half of the presentation. And I want to acknowledge that in terms of the how, the operationalizing and how do we apply a racial equity analysis is something that we normally do in a separate workshop. There's a whole toolkit behind that, and just want to share that information with the group. So we'll touch on some things today, and would love to share additional resources in the future. And I think we are coming back in 10 minutes. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. We'll see you all then. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
the light bulb.
Yes.
And,
Correct.
yeah, I have one outside and I noticed it's better than light. I was afraid because at first I shared it inside. I was complaining. You have leftovers, Carol?
It's the hide here. I was like, I'm just gonna put it here.
I don't know. It's the only group I
All
can
set?
place it.
Do you want me to set, are you
All
gonna
right.
hide it back there? or am I
We're
passing
gonna
it along?
re-engage here, so.
It's still around?
I know, it's still passing on.
I wondered what
happened to
that. Was that? All right, I got its attention.
So I did that with kids. So, yeah.
Ready for,
Dark ones.
You have the dark one.
Welcome back.
It's empty.
Maybe there's another one.
Earl?
I don't need them, they're for everybody.
Okay, we're back, and we're ready to go with the next section, understanding racism and racial disparities.
Thank you for that. Before we keep going, I did want to just shout you all out for having that lively discussion before we went to break. Those conversations are so important. You know, folks often, want to get into the how, and it's critical to acknowledge that for decision-making bodies, it's especially important to be clear on the what. The conversations you've all had today and will continue to have to further clarify your understanding of racial equity will help to ensure that you can have conversations about how to achieve this as you move forward. So again, thank you so much for having that conversation, and I know that it's going to keep moving forward. So thank you again. And before I go to the next slide, I do want to just read out this quote that we have here from John Trudell. Every human being is a raindrop, and when enough of the raindrops become clear and coherent, they become the power of the storm. So particularly this next section, it gets pretty dense, and there's a lot of context that we provide, and it's a lot of uncomfortable context for our history. And it's important to be armed with this particular mindset moving forward. It can seem daunting to jump into this work and to work to counteract it. And if you just keep in mind that, this is the work of coalition building, of working together to solve for inequity, and it's going to make the work ahead and the knowledge that you'll gain much more palatable. So we've moved to the next slide. And one thing that we want to reaffirm is that racial disparities exist in every important aspect of life. From infant mortality to life expectancy, race has the power to predict and even determine success. And race is the lead predictor of outcomes when we norm for all other factors. In order to envision solutions, we must dive deeply into how these impacts uniquely affect diverse communities of color, including Black, Latinx, Middle Eastern, and Asian and Pacific Islander communities. Go to the next slide. So we've already seen a few examples of racial disparities in our country, but it's important to touch specifically on wealth inequality as an issue that is defining. It's caused by and causing many of the other impacts that we see. So you see here that the median wealth for a white family is $147,000. But for a Latino family, it's $6,600. And for a Black family, it's $3,600. In reading these, it's important to note that these are the median wealth, that midpoint. There are many white families that fall well below this level, mine included. I come from a very working class neighborhood. My family still struggles with economic insecurity, and it's something that has it's informed them, it's informed my siblings, it's informed the way that I view the world, and it's something that we have to keep in mind. Just as there are Black and Latino families that have more than what you see on this slide. But this data shows how profound the disparity is. Wealth inequality is endemic across all demographics, and it needs to be tackled across the board. But this graph demonstrates how stark it is for communities of color. And this is why we advocate for evaluating systemic issues from a racial equity lens. Past efforts to create more opportunities, like the New Deal, also exacerbated racial inequity. And that happened even as they established things like the middle class. New efforts to address economic inequity needs to have a focus on race, because if it doesn't, at best, it will leave the underlying issues unaddressed, and at worst, it will create issues that create further harm. You can go to the next slide. So as we review the complexities of racism, we want to highlight how racist sentiment has impacted several communities in particular. Anti-Asian sentiment led to the adoption of our first exclusionary immigration laws, as we touched on earlier in the presentation. We saw that the Page Act of 1875 effectively barred East Asian women from entering the US and marked the end of open borders. And just 5 years later, the Chinese Exclusion Act prohibited the immigration of all Chinese laborers for 10 years. That particular law was done explicitly to placate to anger about Chinese immigration, even though Chinese immigrants only made up 0.002% of the total population. These perceptions of otherness have continually led to negative outcomes for both Asian Americans and Asian immigrants. These negative outcomes have ranged from Japanese internment during World War II to the exponential rise in anti-Asian hate that we've seen since the start of the pandemic. We want to point out that the number of hate crimes reported to police between 2019 and 2020 rose 149%, and that they remain high to this day. Let me go to the next slide. Okay. Perceptions of otherness have fed numerous policies throughout U.S. history, and there really are too many to cover today. But we want to provide a few pivotal examples for this. One early example occurred in 1853 when the Supreme Court of California ruled that Chinese immigrants were not able to testify against white defendants. This ruling effectively freed a man who was convicted of murdering a Chinese minor, because the witnesses to that crime were themselves Chinese. This ruling classified Chinese people alongside Black and Indigenous people as well, because they already were unable to testify against white defendants. 90 years later than that, and 50 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act began, the U.S. did officially end that ban, but it was done in order to improve relations with China, who was then an ally of the U.S. during World War II. In doing so, the U.S. played upon the model minority myth to create support for the change. And this placed depictions of Chinese families opposite of Japanese Americans, who at that point were being interned because of World War II. Anti-AAPI racism remains, despite the expansion of the model minority myth to include other Asian demographics. And this is including from government entities. In 1982, Vincent Chen, a Chinese American man from Detroit, was killed by two unemployed white auto workers who were angry about the popularity of Japanese cars. I want to restate that. A Chinese American man from Detroit was targeted and killed by two men because they were angry about the popularity of Japanese cars. Despite the horrendousness of this crime, they only got 3 years of probation and $3,000 fines. And the judge stated that these were just not the kind of men that you sent to jail. The One positive that came out of this, if any, was that it reinvigorated the Asian American movement, which was also responding to a general rise in discrimination because of the economic recession. We go to the next slide. So one thing we want to touch on is that AAPI, Asian American and Pacific Islander, is a very broad label. We want to be intentional about uplifting communities that are part of that label, but have unique experiences that are not always spoken to. Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander communities have continued to face a range of issues, including higher poverty rates and hyper-targeting by police and immigration enforcement. Filipinos were excluded from the bans on Asian immigration in the late 1800s because at that time the Philippines were a US colony. But this led to a wave of reactionary violence because Filipinos were brought in to solve for the labor shortages that were caused by those bans. This led to a law in 1934 that capped migration of Filipinos at only 50 per year. And in that same year, a court ruling held that they could not apply for citizenship. Reactionary violence has continued to be an issue across AAPI communities. In 1889, for example, more than 100 LAPD officers assaulted and or arrested 36 attendees of a Samoan bridal shower. They did so saying that they were under attack by members of the group, but witness testimony and video evidence disproved that claim. And this led to one of the largest, actually the largest settlement of the time at $23 million. Since that time, police unions have become more adept at circumventing accountability. And 2 years later, they were able to do so in the Rodney King case in LA. Perceptual otherness has left communities vulnerable to regressive enforcement policies to this day. In 2017, for example, the US stepped up deportations of Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees who arrived much earlier because of the Vietnam War and because of the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia. The targeting of these particular communities was in direct violation of international agreements that were designed to prevent targeting of folks who came as refugees from those events. And many of those targeted were born in refugee camps and had never even been to the countries they were being returned to. Patterns of exclusion and otherness have extended to one community in particular that has been a US territory since 1990. Those born in American Samoa, unlike those born in Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, and the Northern Marianas, do not receive citizenship by birth and are instead considered non-citizen nationals. This designation denies them the number of rights enjoyed by US citizens, including the ability to vote, to hold certain public office and private sector jobs, to run for office outside of American Samoa, and to petition for family members who want to immigrate to the US. And go to the next slide. And for Middle Eastern communities and for South Asian communities with significant Muslim populations, or those who get typecast as Middle Eastern, the post 9/11 wave of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim sentiment has been very damaging. In addition to high rates of hate crimes, Arab and Muslim communities have been targeted by a range of programs and laws, including the Patriot Act, and including the NYPD's Muslim Surveillance and Mapping Program. That program lasted from 2002 until 2014 and targeted, quote, every conceivable aspect of Muslim public life. This program extended throughout the Northeast, and it led to rampant civil rights violations and cut down significantly on free speech. At the same time as that program was started in 2002, hundreds of mainly Middle Eastern immigrants were rounded up at INS offices which were the precursor to ICE, after being ordered to comply with a special registration order for anyone over 16. This law represented a clear case of selective profiling and prompted a wave of civil rights litigation. The net total of the fallout of this, creating a profound sense of a real chilling effect on the ability of these communities to feel free and included by our government. Unfortunately, even though those programs were started, those programs and those attempts at targeting Middle Easterners started around that time, they didn't end around that time. The NYPD mapping program lasted in 2014, like I said, but even after that, we've been seeing impacts much like these. Most recently, or more profoundly, I would say in 2017, the U.S. enacted the Muslim ban, which completely shut off travel even for U.S. citizens and residents who were then barred from returning to the U.S. at the moment that it was created. That ban saw multiple iterations in order to try to come into effect, and the Supreme Court eventually ruled that it was admissible in 2018. It lasted up until 2021 and was expanded in 2020 to include non-majority Muslim countries in order to secure that program. But it was officially shut down in 2021. You go to the next slide. We're going to talk about Indigenous communities now. And when you think about Indigenous communities, oftentimes a lot of our rhetoric, a lot of our framing can be hung up in the past. But while genocide and land displacement were integral to the formation of the U.S., the implications of the history are anything but in the past. Lack of sovereignty and systemic neglect has left Indigenous communities vulnerable to environmental racism, systemic violence, and negative health outcomes. And environmental racism remains of particular concern to Indigenous communities, perhaps most notably due to oil pipelines and mining contamination. 1 in 4 Native Americans question the safety of their drinking water. And for health outcomes, Indigenous communities, in addition to Black and Latinx communities, have faced exponentially higher COVID rates. Some states actively impeded Indigenous efforts to respond to the health crisis, and poverty, lack of access to health care, and even inadequate drinking water contributed to worse outcomes. For example, the Navajo Nation experienced the highest per capita rate of COVID in the nation, surpassing even New York City at the height of the pandemic back in 2020. One thing I want to call out now is that graph to the right-hand side. That is the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls cases that occurred in 2016. Now you see that the number there is 5,712 cases, but only 116 of those were logged by the Department of Justice. Indigenous women face particularly high rates of violence, often from non-Native men on Native land. And the murder rate for Indigenous women is 10 times higher than all other races. And the sexual assault rate is 2.5 times higher. These high rates of assault are driven in part by a lack of communication and jurisdictional issues between state, local, and tribal enforcement, as well as the fact that tribal authority does not extend to non-Native offenders, even if the offense occurs on Native land. For Indigenous folks who do not live on reservations, 78% of all Indigenous people, they often experience the same oversights that are experienced in Black and Latinx communities. Go to the next slide. We want to dive a bit deeper on anti-Indigenous racism now, and that means covering a wide array of racial and political concerns that continue to this day. The ones that we're going to hit on include the legacy of boarding schools, modern fights against the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, and sterilization campaigns. The first federal boarding school for Indigenous children opened up in Pennsylvania in 1879. And these boarding schools were explicitly created to separate children from their families. This was done so in order to break up Indigenous societies, cultures, religions, and languages. They were known for their brutal conditions, including malnutrition and physical and sexual assault. And families were not able to refuse these schools until the passing of the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978. Up until that time, around 150,000 children were taken from their parents, and as many as 40,000 died in these schools. Many were never returned to their families. In the same decade as the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, we saw the passing of the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act. This act, passed in 1970, paved the way for the sterilization of 25% to 42% of all childbearing age women, often as young as 15, between 1970 and 1976. That law subsidized sterilization for patients who receive their health care through the Indian Health Services and for Medicaid patients. And Black and Latina women were also targeted by coercive sterilization campaigns during this time. Returning back to ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, that law was meant to end policies that incentivize the adoption of Indigenous children into Indigenous homes. Out of Indigenous homes. And as many as 1/3 of all Indigenous children were removed from their families in the period between 1941 and 1967. 90% of all of these children went to non-Indigenous families. This act routinely faces noncompliance by states and is currently facing challenges that allege that the preference for keeping children in Indigenous children in Indigenous families is itself a form of racism. I'm going to pass this back over to Daryl, who is going to take us through anti-Latinx racism.
Thank you, Jared. Yes, as we transition over to the foundations of anti-Latinx and Hispanic racism, it's important to acknowledge that anti-Latinx racism has been a feature in the U.S. Since at least the 1840s, when the U.S. acquired 55% of Mexico's territory at the end of the Mexican-American War. This gave rise to both segregation and hate crimes, including lynching and mob violence. While the first immigration laws were designed to exclude Asians, anti-Latinx policies followed soon thereafter. The first instances of mass deportation occurred in the 1920s and 30s. Up to 2 million people were deported, and as many as 80% of them U.S. citizens. This mass deportation started due to the Great Depression and anger over labor competition, and continued as a way to prevent Latinx individuals from accessing New Deal benefits. Latinx people continue to face systematic discrimination and experience hate crimes, the latter of which surged to an 11-year high in 2019. Hate crimes rose from 485 to 587, which is an 8.7% increase. 22 of the 51 racially motivated murders were a result of the El Paso shooting. Next slide, Melissa. Just as Latinx communities have continued to be otherized and targeted by both enforcement and racially motivated attacks, government policy has continually eroded their economic and social well-being. Following the pattern of other New Deal era programs, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 further exacerbated income inequality by intentionally excluding agricultural, domestic, and service workers from the bill's protections and wage hikes. These exclusions are still a major issue, particularly in the agricultural industry due to the worsening heat from climate change. Thus far, we've seen a number of instances where immigration law targeted a number of communities since 1875. Nowadays, it seems that given we need deterrent-based policies that heavily rely on deportation and detention. The current iteration of these policies came from the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act of 1996, also known as IRA. Greatly expanded the number of immigrants eligible for deportation, limited the ability of judges to grant leeway, and stripped the rights of anyone living within 100 miles of the border to appear before a judge, 2/3 of the total U.S. population. This has led to deportation numbers only seen during the Great Depression, this time relying heavily on private contractors at a much higher cost compared to humane alternatives. This strategy has coalesced with measures meant to deter communities, even among those with legal status, from attaining public services. The 2019 expansion of the public charge rule, created in the late 1800s, made it more difficult for documented immigrants to remain as permanent residents if they have used or if they considered using public resources. Next slide, Melissa. This next slide will begin to talk more about the foundations of anti-Black racism. Anti-Black racism has clear roots in slavery, lasting for over 200 years between the periods of 1619 and 1865. Implications of this history reverberate. While slavery began in the US in 1619, individual states began legalizing it in 1641, first in Massachusetts. Formally made hereditary, first in Virginia in 1662, extended to life in Maryland in 1664. In 1704, the first former slave patrol created in the Carolina colony, tasked with tracking down runaways, preventing revolts, and breaking up meetings organized by enslaved peoples, provided the framework for preventative policing in the South, which evolved into Jim Crow segregation. Once slavery was made illegal, states started passing laws hyper-targeting formerly enslaved people by the criminal justice system, which exempted them from the protections against forced labor. These Black codes were later followed by Jim Crow, which formally segregated the post-Reconstruction era South. These two events occurred as bookends to the Reconstruction era, meant to mend the nation post-Civil War, ultimately failed to provide lasting protection or equality for Black Southerners. Next slide, Melissa. While anti-Black racism has long been codified in our laws, anti-Black racism often resulted in direct insubordination of our government, the Civil War being the most notable example. In 1898, the Wilmington insurrection overthrew the elected biracial government made up of free Black Republicans and white working class populists. 60 to 250 murders, 100 plus Black officials were ousted. In 1919, we know of Red Summer, a wave of mob violence against Black communities in 26 cities, the precursor to the Tulsa Massacre 2 years later. It's estimated that hundreds were killed, thousands were injured, and more lost homes. This came at the end of World War I as Black veterans were advocating for better pay and worker protections. There were a number of punitive government changes in the 1990s, including the Immigration Act, which was discussed, IRA. More well-known cuts to welfare and drastic increases to incarceration rates passed in large part due to anti-Black narratives. Around the same time, between the years of 1991 and 1994, the US sent thousands of Haitian asylum seekers to Guantanamo Bay, playing on fears of the HIV epidemic. This is just one of many instances where anti-Black racism has extended to Black immigrant communities, and Black immigrants remain hyper-targeted by our system. Move on to the next slide, please. And so this slide shows the shared impacts of racism. While we've touched briefly on some of the foundational causes and modern impacts of racism against a number of communities in the US, it is important to look at these numbers that we see here. Each of these groups And as the slide shows, Black and Latinx individuals have been historically marginalized and hyper-targeted. Even as formerly non-white Eastern and Southern European communities were adopted into this white identity. As we look at this slide, we're able to see that these statistics are stark. We see that 6 in 10 individuals, U.S. prisoners are Black or Latinx descent, yet they only comprise 30% of the U.S. population. We see here that 65% Black or Latinx male students will graduate from high school, whereas 80% of white male students will do the same. Black and Indigenous unemployment is 2 times higher than white unemployment, and then 57% of Black and Latinx individuals spend more than 30% of their income on housing costs. As this slide shows, almost as a pictograph, it really highlights the stark differences in the statistics between white people and persons of color. Next slide, Melissa. So we just covered a lot of ground as it relates to both historical and current discrimination and inequities facing communities of color. But this is far from a complete picture of the issues faced by those communities or a complete picture of prejudice and discrimination more generally in our country. It is important to restate how patterns of discrimination continue to affect communities deemed to fall outside of the modern definition of whiteness, and continue to consider how factors such as religion and sexual orientation also play into the notions of otherness. As we can see within these 2019 hate crime statistics, we see that a majority of them are based on race and ethnicity. In the picture to the right, we can see the US hate crime at its highest level in over a decade. And what that tells us is that, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, that race has become the predictor. It is even a predictor when it comes to hate crimes. And so it's something for us to really take into consideration as we think about the stark differences in the statistics that face white Americans versus Americans of color. I'm going to now pass it over to Jared to talk more about the solidarity dividend.
Thank you, Daryl. So the solidarity dividend is in many ways a kindred concept to intersectionality that we talked about earlier. And it posits that everyone becomes better off by working collectively to solve systemic inequity. At this point, we have learned about the exclusions in housing policies that stagnated entire communities, as well as the exemptions in legislation like the National Labor Relations Act that continue to harm workers across racial lines, even if communities of color are hyper-targeted. According to this theory, communities that oppose measures to advance racial equity do so out of a belief in zero-sum politics, or the idea that what is good for one community must be bad for another. This is a scarcity mindset, and it's one that has been perpetuated in our country to the detriment of people across racial and political lines. It's led to a variety of policies, including anti-labor right-to-work policies, the welfare reforms of the 90s, and the 2005 anti-bankruptcy law that further exacerbated the Great Recession. It's historically led to the dwindling of support among white people for public amenities, such as public pools, and this happened as the country was segregating. This even led to public support for economically populist measures like a federal jobs guarantee or minimum income, as popularity for those shrunk from 70% in 1956 and 1960 to just 35% in 1964. Now, as we know, this was during the Civil Rights era, and the dwindling of that popularity came in direct reaction to what was going on. The kind of racial animus that rises from zero-sum thinking has informed and perpetuated the drafting of and support for policies that perpetuate racial disparities. And the resulting fallout both reinforces this line of thinking and perpetuates the kinds of policy shifts that are meant to target certain demographics, like immigrants, Black and Indigenous communities, Asian American, Latino American communities, but in turn affects all communities ranging from low-income communities to working class and middle-class communities. We have seen these effects across a range of public goods, including education, the cost of college, healthcare, housing, and other social programs. And these have led to a vast number of negative impacts, including poor air quality, depressed worker benefits, and recessions. Ultimately, the solidarity dividend is about the idea that working collectively is the only way to advance not only racial equity, but equity in general. You can go to the next slide. So in her book and in subsequent interviews, Heather McGee, the author who came up or who termed the term solidarity dividend, lifts up 3 examples of solidarity in action that can be categorized along 3 lines: movement-based, community reinvigoration, and community safeguarding. The Fight for 15 is a prime example of a movement-based solidarity and represents cross-racial organizing led by workers of color that benefits working-class communities across the board. This resulted in wins in several municipalities, including Seattle, Washington, and Tucson, Arizona, and several states, including California and Florida, and Florida just passed a $15 minimum wage in 2020. Since 2012, 26 million low-wage workers have won $150 billion in annual raises, and 76 billion of this went to workers of color. In her next example, McGee uplifts the town of Lewiston, Maine, which was revitalized in the 1990s due to an influx of French-speaking African refugees. This example also had a secondary impact for older retirees with French-Canadian heritage, some of whom embraced the idea, who embraced that shared cultural unifier of the French language and ended up helping newer arrivals acclimate to the community. That example had the uplifts both the economic benefits that community brought when they came to Lewiston, Maine, as well as the shared benefit of that pre-established community that got that cultural boon from working with the newly arrived refugees at that same time. And the last example that she uplifts is Richmond, California, who back in the early 2000s, residents were mobilizing to prevent a plant expansion in an area of town that was 97% people of color. The area already had higher rates of cancer and asthma due to the plant that already existed there. But the community nearby, a predominantly white, predominantly wealthy community, was also experiencing those same negative outcomes. That example of a community mobilizing to prevent further harm highlights both the spirit of solidarity as well as the reality that a disparity that harms one group is still likely to harm us all. Go to the next slide. So I'm going to read out this slide because I think it's a very important one that's going to transition us to the next section. Systemic change does not happen overnight. Developing systems of change can lead to a greater future and a better now. It's a really big takeaway that we want you leaving with. This work of racial equity is a continual process, and it's an intentional process. We want to envision where we want to be, but we don't want to think of that as a future place that's a static finish line, because that can make the work ahead even more daunting, and you're setting yourself up for frustration because this process is a continual process. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Daryl to take us through some next steps.
Thank you, Jared. So before we move on to the next slide, I just want to mention that we did hear you all talking about some next steps and wanted some ideas about what are some of the things that you all can do as a body, to begin to create these equitable communities that we've been talking about. And so on the next slide, we'll talk about what that looks like. And in the coming slides, we'll give you some examples of ways for you to get started. So Melissa, we can go to the next slide. Before we get to the examples, it's important for us to shift our questions away from individuals to systems. And what I want to highlight before I read, go through some of the things on this slide is that you all as individuals have a role to play as this body, but we want to shift away from this individual mindset to a systems mindset. And it's important because, as you mentioned, in as much as you want to make sure on the individual level, you're shifting your biases, being aware of your biases so that you can interact with the community and interact with your peers differently. When it comes to creating policies and procedures, we want to move from an individual basis to a systems mindset. And so we want to move from blame, where we're asking questions of who's a racist, to causes, which says what's causing the racial inequities. We want to move from intentions, where we're asking questions of what did they mean and what was their attitude, to effects, which ask what were the actions, what are the impacts. We want to move from that prejudice mindset of what beliefs made them do it to a systems mindset that says what institutions are responsible. And then lastly, we want to move from a grievance perspective where we ask how can we fix what just happened, to a solutions mindset that asks what proactive strategies and solutions can we begin to implement. And so as we think about some of those things, like I said, it's important to understand that we all as individuals, you all as individuals as part of this body, have decisions to make, and you want to make sure that you're working on your biases. But in terms of shifting policy and shifting procedures and practices, we want to move from that individual thinking to a systems thinking, to a systems mindset. And once we can move to the next slide. And so this is the last slide we'll touch before we get back to you all to talk about your remarks, reactions, reflections, and questions. But these are some of the ways that you can get started. And those ways include, passing a resolution or ordinance that affirms your commitment to racial equity, drafting a racial equity vision statement. As we talked about early on about, as a part of our national practices, visioning a racially equitable community is in some ways an integral part to creating that community that all feel welcome. And so creating that vision statement or a draft racial equity vision statement is really allowing you to say, what do we want as the city of Concord? How are we thinking about racial equity? And when we create that vision statement, what we're saying is we want it to be lofty. We want it to be open. We want it to include everyone. And it may not be something that you can achieve today, tomorrow, maybe within the next decade, but it's something that you hope that whoever's in your role beyond your time here, they can look at this and say, this is the vision that we have for our community, because we hope that anybody coming into this community can fit these goals and can meet these goals. The next thing here is develop an Office of Equity and Inclusion. What we talk about, here at REAL is that the Office of Equity and Inclusion is really just a place where people can go to ask for help, but it is not the only place whose dedication is focusing on racial equity. Everyone is focused on racial equity. Everyone is focused on making sure that we create that equitable community, but developing an Office of Equity and Inclusion creates a space for people to go when they have questions about what are the right steps to take. Next, we mentioned using a budgeting for racial equity tool in your next budgeting process. What that means is, does your budgeting process have a racial equity lens? Are you viewing it through a racial equity lens to ensure that, no one is burdened, and those who may have been historically burdened are better off? And so as we think about using this racial equity tool, we want to make sure that you're using the racial equity tool in the budgeting process, but not only in the budgeting process, in all of the ways that we create policy within the city. The next thing we talk about is adopting a racial equity action plan. What does that mean? Creating actionable steps in order to get to that equitable community. Creating this action plan is really a step-by-step plan on what you're going to do to create a more safe space for all who live in your community. And then, as we've talked about before, I know that we've talked this over with both Tom and Jim, but having a conversation about creating a racial equity core team. What does that mean? As we talked about before, when we talked about organizing for racial equity, creating the infrastructure within the city to be able to make sure that this work is long-term. and it's embedded in the work that you do on an everyday basis. And that team is made up, as I mentioned before, the breadth and depth. So you have managers, you have executive level staff, you also have frontline staff that are made up on this team so that they can bring different perspective, different ideas, to this space where we can all have a conversation around what it looks like to have a racially equitable Concord. And so these are some ways for you to get started, and we wanted to just create this space for you to think about, these are not the only ways, as I mentioned before, but some of the ways. So we wanted to create this space for you to think about ways for the community, for you all to get started with it within the community. I'm going to now transition over to Shauna for our second section on the remarks, reactions, reflections, and questions.
Thank you, Daryl. So we want to create an opportunity again for you all to have a conversation with each other, to share any remarks, reactions, reflections, or questions that came up as you saw the second half of the presentation. And we have about 20 minutes again for you all to spend some time together talking about your reactions, your reflections, and questions.
What do you think, Cody?
Thank you, Your Honor. This has been very helpful, but I think it's important that as a community, we identify all the things we've done right so far. And that's not to suggest that we don't have areas of improvement we can act on. But I think offensive is the wrong word to use, but I think some folks will take this like we're being lectured, like that there's a lot that needs to be done. I think we've done a lot. There's a lot more that can be done, but it's been helpful, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. To Councilor Keach's point, as this was very enlightening, it was very good, but as I'm going through the action steps, who or what becomes the final arbiter and determines success of what we do? Is it the voters, is it the citizens, is it the community itself? How do we measure a success? Those kinds of things. I'm confused on when we start looking at these plans, who says it's right?
I bet we'd probably come up with 15 different answers from 15 different people, but I mean, I think that, when we talked about lofty goals and having an action plan, and in terms of measuring, I think we're all probably going to measure individually, but I do think that as community leaders, we're going to have to be able to measure in terms of those institutional things. Are we eliminating barriers for success and creating opportunities for people to succeed? I think those we can measure. I mean, individually, we might all have different thresholds as what success might be, but I do think as we sit around this table and we have been entrusted with the voters of this community to lead, and I think we can measure by looking at our policies, looking at, and I think there's two parts to it. There's the policy pieces that we do. Like, I really appreciated in terms of the ways it gets started that there was a mention about budgeting cycle and when we budget. I thought that was a really key. They were all really good ideas, I have to say. But there are certain things that strike, I'm sure, each individual, what we think about. And I think that budget document is one of the most important things we do because it reflects our values and reflects where we put our priorities as a community and such. And, I immediately started thinking about what can we do to, when we evaluate the budget, agency by agency, in terms of how we deliver those services in the budget and making sure that we're providing opportunities for every single person in this community. And maybe, when it goes back to the first part when we talk about maybe unintentionally we've created a barrier that we didn't even know about in the past. But with a little more reflection this time and when we do the budgeting, I think we can identify those and then act appropriately. So it may take a little more time, But I think they're all measurable. That's anybody, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to key off of what you said, Your Honor. I mean, I think you're right. The budget is probably the most important thing that we do, and it also has the greatest impact on the community and how the community is shaped and formed and how we prioritize. What's a priority and what are not priorities. But I think that regarding Councilor Pierce's question, I think we can create touch points. The idea of putting together a plan, I think, means that we do create those milestones that are indicators of success. The other thing I think that's important is that we understand that this is, I think, the first step in a process. This is not the end goal around this table. This is the beginning of a process that we have to shape, in consultation with experts, such as the folks from NCL, and our community. And I think we need to start to create opportunities for us to listen to our community, hear from members of our community, and I mean our entire community, our New American community, our communities of people of color who are not New Americans, and our old-time Yankee families and community members. I think that this is an opportunity to embark upon a community conversation that's meaningful and that has real concrete goals.
I will confess you jumped ahead where I was going, but you usually are 10 steps ahead of me, so that's okay.
Oh, that's not true.
But I do think that it's important to point out that this is but a first step. I mean, we're at the very, very beginning of this process, and there's a lot of us, tasks ahead of us. But one of the key things that I was going to talk about was we're going to be coming back, and this is where, you'll be sworn in as counselors, and we're going to sit down for our traditional priority agenda setting session in January. And I'd really like this to be one of the topics that we talk about during the priority agenda setting. But I think the next step, the most immediate next step, is now to reflect outward. And as you said, have this conversation, with the community. And there's different ways of doing that. And if you think that's a good idea, we need to explore how we want to do that, where we want to do that, how often we want to, those type of things. So my hope is that at the priority agenda, which I think would probably be the next logical place to really have a deeper dive in these type of things to talk about it.
Thank you.
Sure, please.
I'd just like to, and I know this is really for you, and Jim and I are here. We're going to be doing our own training piece and educational piece with the National League of Cities, but you've done this. You know what to do. This is going to be actually, I think, a lot of fun because it's just being more conscious about what you do. Because if you really look at what this community has done, what community of 45,000 people has 7 free neighborhood pools that you provide free swimming lessons to any child in the community every single year, working with the Concord Housing Redevelopment Authority? That's an equity piece. When you looked at the school district, when the Concord School District redid its entire school system and built new schools around the downtown, and the city staff came to you and said, could we use some of the surplus dollars to buy new sidewalk tractors so we can dramatically increase the plowing of the sidewalks so children could walk to school, particularly because they're going to have to walk greater distances because of the way the schools are? You didn't hesitate. And you funded those, and we were able to dramatically increase the amount of sidewalk plowing. And you can do that again. You can do that more. When you look at 8,000 acres of open space property that you've acquired over the years, and making sure there's free trails in there, and then you work with those neighborhoods and people have access to all the parks. Every time you do one of those types of projects, you are consciously or unconsciously looking at providing equity to the community and access to the community to resources. So you can do that in every single department, and you have been doing it, but I think if you thought about it consciously, there's so much more we could be doing. And it's not, you're not gonna break the bank, it's just a different approach of doing things. And actually, I think as the mayor suggested about talking to the community, I think the community has changed over the last 10 years, 20 years. It'd be interesting, I think, for all of us to find out how has it changed, what are the new needs for the community, particularly the refugee folks who have moved in, who are no longer refugees, who are now American citizens. What are their needs? How can we access those and figure those out? So when you're looking at your budget, you know, are you actually creating a barrier or are you actually helping somebody? So you can do this. This is not going to be, I don't think, a really difficult lift. I think it's going to be a very positive thing that we can do for the community, and I think the community will embrace you doing this.
Just to add, and I think, you know, as we look at those successes, or we look at those points of accessibility, I think that one of the things we can do moving forward in this process is just try to become more and more aware of cultural differences that we may not be aware of, that, for example, you know, might be an impediment to access to those pools. Or, are there folks in the community, who, for whom walking in the woods is not a recreational thing, it's maybe not a positive thing. But, I think about the famous story of whoever it was who had the Nova, Chevy, and Chevy marketed the Nova in Latin America. And suddenly, they couldn't figure out why the sales weren't going well, and then they realized that Nova in Spanish means it doesn't run. And it's those unconscious, it's a silly story, but there are unconscious things that we do. And I think that part of this process can be just trying to attune ourselves and really, really, really be intentional.
Thank you. I think one thing you said, Tom, that resonated with me is asking, what do you need? And not providing what we think you need, but what do you need is an important step. The other thing escaped my mind. You may come back.
As Tom was speaking there and the mayor's comment, I started to think about how much I enjoyed during the parking forum hearing from people about their needs in the neighborhood, things that we hadn't necessarily thought of, or streets that we hadn't thought of. And I'm wondering if a setting like that might be appropriate, depending on how we facilitate it. That might be a mechanism to get some feedback from the community.
Great idea.
I remember
Write it down.
some of the things that the city is doing, like the driving lessons for the refugees or people that aren't familiar with driving in this country, and explanation of the laws of this country, and police. I mean, many folks come from a place where they're really afraid of the police, and working to become friendly, working on that issue, that, the police are here to help you, not hurt you. And I remember when I did the ride around in Concord with one of the policemen, and we went up to one of the housing developments on the Heights, and all the kids came running out, "Hi, Officer so-and-so, hi." And he had a good rapport with that whole community, and that was nice to see. We need to do more of it.
Hey, one thing before I recognize Gail. In terms of, moving forward, one of the things I think is important that we do an assessment of kind of not only internally, like I think what you're doing, but do an assessment the best we can in what's going on in the community, because I don't think there's a need for us to create a bunch of new items, programs, whatever it might be, when there are already really, really good organizations in our community who are doing wonderful things. The question is, how can we enhance what they do? How can we potentially partner with them and such? So that would be I think part of the kind of the assessment that, in other words, there's no need for us to duplicate effort when there's already people who probably know better than us, and how, but how can we help them and help ourselves and such, so, not very good.
Thank you, Your Honor. I agree with a lot of the things that have been said. I actually like the ideas, and I wanted to bring back to mind, remember our civics class that we had here going on? That seemed to be really well received. And I know that I think COVID probably shut it down a bit, but, I mean, those are things where we're welcoming and hearing what people, you know, it's a free exchange of information, ideas, people getting an understanding of that. And I think that we all have those opportunities to reach out and make those connections that can really make a difference. So all of those things gathered together, they might be small individually, but overall they can really make an impact.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To your point about budgeting and how important that is to this whole process, over the last many years, we've struggled as a community to figure out what nonprofits to subsidize or fund or not. And perhaps one of the criteria we could use going forward is making this part of the priority, because they're all deserving, but it's always a struggle for me personally to figure out who to fund and who not to. And so maybe this could be worked into that process somehow.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This was very informative and I think helpful. And I just want to go back to if we do reach out to the community, that we find a way to reach out to the community that usually doesn't come to sessions where you have a community gathering. Because I've been to similar things like that before, and everybody at the table is the people you see all the time. And so we're all thinking we know what's best. So if we can come up with a way that makes it comfortable for everyone in the community to come and talk, faces we usually don't see or faces who usually doesn't come. And I don't know how we do that yet, but I think that would be more beneficial than just regular talk to us.
You make an excellent point. I think there is a model there. I mean, and sometimes it may be just smaller group sessions and such. But I think if we reflect back, there was a memo by the city manager to us recently about library usage on the Heights. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that the manager and I had talked about before that came out is flip it on its head and start pretending like we know exactly what people want from our services and go out specifically to those communities and ask them themselves. And I think you saw in that memo all the list of the organizations and individuals that that the library approached and had discussions with, and as a result, I think really changed the approach into hours of operation and such. And I think there's other things that are going to come from those discussions that we'll see in the future. So I think your point is really well made, that not everybody is comfortable in a larger group setting, and maybe it's incumbent upon us to even break up in smaller groups and to go out to not only find in terms of our assessment, not only go out to larger organizations, but create smaller group opportunities.
Thank you. I agree. And I think one thing we could think about too is, if we look at our committees, do we have the right mix of folks serving in those, representing all the constituencies that are most impacted by decisions, or having some kind of, one of the recommendations, you know, an equity lens as we're making decisions, not just through budgeting, but through committee discussions. And I think being very intentional about talking about various constituencies in those groups so that we all have a shared understanding. I know that my own personal activities, you know, put me in touch with certain groups, and I'm sure you all get in touch with other groups. And so having some shared understanding through council, like who are the major players or voices, independent voices, who can help bring some of this to the forefront in our area. And I would say continuing the review of policies, and when we do review policies, to invite those constituencies most impacted by them to play a role in a formal or informal setting.
I'm really glad you brought up the issue of committees. It's been something that I've struggled with for years. And that if you noticed, when we take up names of people, typically if one of you all have recommended somebody, 9 times out of 10 they get appointed. And typically if they're not appointed, it's because they chose they didn't want to participate. So I really look at the committees, and I really struggle to try to find those diversities that we need and expect to have. But having said that, it is not as easy to achieve as we think it might be. So it's I need your. What I'm saying to you is I need your help to do that. And many of you are great in doing this, so, but everybody's got to give me a hand in that one, because I don't know everybody in the community, and I search out, and if you look through the committees, you'll notice there's patterns and trends, and but it's not as easy to find people to serve as you think at times. So I'll just share that with you.
Thank you. I'm really glad you bring that up, and I don't have an immediate recommendation what we should do here, but I do want to just raise up that, serving in elected positions or serving on committees is a time-consuming event, and, there's some modest compensation for city councilors, very modest for state legislators, if you could call it that. But, one of the things that we talk about in some of this work is that if you want people who are most impacted by policies, you also have to recognize that that usually means they're disproportionately impacted and have other constraints. And so being able, transportation, childcare, just reimbursement of time, emotional labor for some of the conversations that you want to have, those are all things that we really have to take into consideration as well. And it's different to think about that, right, from a city perspective, but those are real challenges that people face, or working moms who slide in late to meetings because they have childcare pickup. Those are all just things that are on people's plates.
I would think a good source to look to try to find members, diversity of color or refugees for committees is that group. Is it Change Concord or
Change for Concord?
Change for Concord, those wonderfully intelligent folks who came here and spoke to us more than once. They're showing real leadership, and I would think they might be a good source for finding folks to serve on committees. They could make recommendations.
There are a lot of great places to look. I will share with you, I think it goes to your point, Counselor, and that is that even if you can find the right people at times, there are challenges for folks to serve.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they're work, sometimes they're just life, sometimes they're childcare, sometimes they're taking care of their parents, sometimes it's the hours in which the committee meets. So it's more than just. I made my pitch to you to help me find the people, but it's also looking at the committee structure, and I think we generally have a pretty good committee structure, but it's looking to make sure that folks are meeting at the right times, folks are meeting in the right places, so that gives everybody an opportunity to participate who would like to participate.
You got ahead of me, Your Honor, because I was going to say that maybe one of the things we might want to look at relative to committees is where they meet and be more flexible. A lot of meetings take place in this complex right here, the City Council chambers and City Hall, and it might be that we might get more diverse members if we moved our meetings to other parts of the city that are more accessible.
It's definitely something we should think about and talk about. I will share with you that there's expectation that our city staff will participate within those committees, and so there's that challenge that if we start going around the community, that we won't have the necessary expertise and staff to be able to do that. So I think it's a great idea. I can tell you, I remember when we used to take the council on a road show throughout the community and hold meetings at different places. And unfortunately, they were very sparsely attended. And the second thing was the introduction of the community television, which so many people I find really rely on in the community to participate in their governmental process, whether it be school board or planning board or zoning board or this body, that it's become more important that live transmission. And when we move to other places, we lose that. And so I like the idea of going different places and going on the road. I still think that's actually a good idea, but I don't want to exclude anybody from wanting to be able to know what's going on and participate in local government. And that's, I think we need to figure out if you all agree that it's a good idea. I got 1, 2, 3, I think.
I hate to be the guy to say this, but I find Zoom very, very effective, very convenient, and it shouldn't replace what we do, but in terms of committee meetings, that might be a good solution, because I appreciate Zondra's comments. I mean, you've got young kids. That's tough. I'm at a point where I don't have to deal with that. So to attract younger people, more diverse people, you know, maybe Zoom committee meetings is maybe an option. I know a lot of people will be opposed to that.
I think our solicitor has a comment about that one.
Oh, okay.
Can I make a comment? Because I'm gonna, well, can I preempt the city solicitor on that?
Oh, no, I just telling you have 2 minutes.
2-minute warning.
So, as part of my work, I go to other municipalities sometimes, and I've been to a number of municipalities, at least one, where they do actually a hybrid. So they've got people in the room, and then they've also got a Zoom option with a nice screen so that, you know, they can take testimony from people in the room. They can also take testimony from the public on the screen, and even assuming they've got a quorum in the room, some of the members can appear that way.
And we're working for that in that direction.
And I think, you know, I know we've had that conversation over the last year, or I guess it's 2 years now. But I think that would be, I mean, we saw many more people participate when we were on Zoom. Now, for us, it was not as great an experience, I think, but it did provide more access to certain members of the committee, our community. Not everybody. Obviously, some of our regulars didn't like it, but providing a hybrid option gives people kind of the best of both worlds and provides more opportunity for input, I think.
Anybody else want to last comments? And I think, Zandra, you...
Oh, I just had one other thing, and this is actually a little bit less about the systems, or systemic racism, and more just making sure that we're allowing people to feel included and represented in our community. I was really struck by part of the conversation around Indigenous Peoples Day, about what structures we have that acknowledge Indigenous people, which are not really any, and the couple that we do have in town that actually perpetuate some of the you know, really horrible things that happened in the past. And so it got me thinking, like, you know, there's communities where you have, it's very vibrant and present, and you have in your art installations and on buildings and other things, you can just see the vibrancy of the community. And I actually feel like we have a pretty amazing, diverse community, and maybe we can look at, with upcoming projects, ways that we can be more visually representative of our community. And I do know there's going to be a multicultural mural going up on the Heights, which I think is great, but I think more of that would also be lovely.
Ms. Kennedy, I think.
So I think we're now at the conclusion wrap-up stage for National League of Cities. Have some final remarks and some parting words and good advice to us.
I think that may be a cue for us, so I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you We really appreciated the opportunity to connect with you all and support you in the great work that you are doing and will continue to do. And I want to say thank you to the mayor, thank you to Tom and Jim, thank you to council members that are current and council members newly to be brought in. We really appreciate your time and thank you for your commitment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As this last slide states, we just wanted to emphasize this point. I am no longer accepting the things that I cannot change, and I'm changing the things I cannot accept, by Angela Davis. And I think the discussion that you all have had tonight in both sessions for the reflections portions of our time together really, hones in on this point that, when we get to a point where we can no longer accept things, we have to make some changes. And I think you all are actively having conversations around what changes need to be made and what changes you all have to be a part of. And so, again, I want to just reiterate what Shauna mentioned in saying that we really thank you for having us. We look forward to continuing our work with Concord, and we're excited that you all made the decision to have us here. As I've heard, you've had other conversations with other community members, and so we're excited about what this journey will look like when we, not that there's a getting to the other side, but as we continue on this journey, we're excited to see where the city of Concord ends up.
Thank you much.
It is 7:55. We will let you all go, but we thank you again, and you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you,
Thank
Darrell.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Talk to you later.
Thank you.
So I was going to ask, is this,
No.
so are we, do we have a next step with the NLC, or was this,
For you, this is
it? And then,
well, you could always, when you're looking at,
our portion with them is through. Our portion, I want to talk about it priority agenda setting, but
yeah, but so we'll be doing the staff portion next as we work on this, but we wanted to prioritize yours first, so that you could get it done this year, and you'd be able to get it done with the existing councilors and the 2 new councilors coming in. So that's why this was done now. They were looking at doing staff first, because that's usually the mode that they're in, is doing a lot of staff work. So, so we'll be taking it. Our whole piece is different than your piece, for what we're doing that next.
Quickly, as part of the census, and understanding that our community is changing, do we have the latest racial and ethnic population of our city from this latest census, and how does it compare to 10 years ago and 20 years ago?
I'll have to take a look and see how deep the data is at this point. It usually comes out in pieces. I'm not sure if all the things that you would need, because really what you're going to be looking at is not only the racial pieces, but you're looking at the economic income pieces and everything else that goes along with it.
Right.
So, and that takes almost 2 years for everything to come out. But it should be coming, and it was delayed because of previous policies in Washington for whatever reason. The way to put it.
Well said.
But we will have it eventually. And then actually you're going to need all that information to do your new master plan. Well, the planning board will need it to do its new master plan too.
I've actually looked for it, and a lot of it's available statewide. But
Right,
it's not
not
available.
broken down yet.
Yeah, no,
At least
I've seen it statewide.
It may be there, but I can't find it, so.
I've just seen it statewide.
And interestingly, New Hampshire has gone from 94% white to 86% white in the last 10 years.
Anybody else have anything for the good of the order?
Oh, thank you.
Make a motion?
Move we adjourn?
Second?
Made second, we adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, ayes have it.
Funded the video, was it taxpayer money, city, state?
Well, we have a contract with New Hampshire, I apologize, National League of Cities. The data that they presented, I don't know where that's their product, work product. But we, the city, contracted with them to start this process, yes. Does that make sense?